Hey there, Sorry. Hey there, Wormwooders? Should we call people things? Oh, some of our fans have started calling themselves Spore Weevils? Hey there, Spore Weevils. We're going to talk today a little bit about how Wormwood was designed. It's gone through a very weird and lengthy design process, and this tends to get people going when we're at conventions, so I figure we should talk about this on video. So if you haven't seen Wormwood at a convention, if you haven't seen it in person and you haven't talked with us, let's go into how this thing was made and why this thing was made, because it's had a long gestation. Wormwood started as a very different game. When it started, Wormwood had a board. It had hexes, it had cubes, and your civilization also had lines that went between freedom and slavery and communism and capitalism, and I had these ideas that I could create a simple enough system that represented every civilization that ever existed or ever would exist, using a series of relatively simple sliders that, when moved around in the right ways, would generate all of these civilizations on the Earth. And this was over-ambitious, and when we played the first game of Wormwood, it broke instantaneously. Like, it didn't work. There wasn't even, one turn that worked. The game just failed completely. And I was heartbroken, because I had spent, a month making this thing. And I had a degree in game design, and I knew I shouldn't do this, and I had already done it because I was so sure this was going to work. Everything had to be scrapped except for one thing. That was talents and drones. These dual-sided tokens that were representing people in your society, they were supposed to represent happy and sad people. That was the only thing I was doing, was you start off with happy people, you have happy people work and fight, and when they work and fight too much, they become unhappy, and if they become sufficiently unhappy, your civilization riots. This was a foundational problem that I'd already been wrestling with, which was trying to represent a game that could be played in 2 hours that was about people, not about fighting, and it was about ideas, not about money. This was not an easy task, it turned out, and I expected the game to be finished in a year. And we're still making it. It's been 10 years and we're still working on it. So here's why. I already said the Wormwood was a game about people, and it turns out that is a really hard way to create a game system, because it's very easy to drive a system by money. We all understand it, we all use money, it's intuitive. But making a game that's entirely about people and the ideas and behaviors that drive human beings is really hard, especially if you want the game to be more funny than it is depressing. And Wormwood hopefully is both.
Convicts, layabouts, aristocrats, kings. Every man is born again in the acids of the mines.
When I was making cards for Wormwood, I would find art that I really liked. I would just scour DeviantArt and ArtStation, and I would just find artists that were incredible. I would put their art into my little square, and then I would write poetry about the art that I found. And that was how I made every card at the beginning, was I would find a piece of art, write poems, and then find mechanics that matched the poem. People will sometimes look at decks, because we've got 10 decks in the game, and they'll say, I understand the traditional CCG archetype. And I'm like, that's great, because I didn't do that. That's not something that I chose. No, that was entirely a side effect of, thematic connections that I was making between the mechanics and the poetry of the game. So some examples of how that worked. So, here are 3 cards here. I've Synthos Memorial, I've got the White Bishops, and the Chimera Symbionts here. These are all from 3 different decks, and from 3 very, very different artists. So the Chimera Symbionts here are Benedict Bana, White Bishops here from Joel Amat Well, and the Synthos Memorial here is an amazing picture by Leon Tucker, who is doing just a kick-ass job on Magic right now. Each of these cards, when I found the art, I just stuck it in, it felt really right, I wrote the title to match the picture, and then I wrote some weird poem at the bottom, and then something fits. So here I got my little poem, and then it says health lost from adjacent units is placed on this card instead of the crash. Why? Why is health from adjacent units placed on this card instead of the crash? Well, the idea was that, for this card in particular, as things died, they would fill the symbiont with sort of a conceptual energy, but also a real energy, and that they would be capable of transferring that energy to other military or civilian units. They take in the pain from things outside of their civilization, and they transfer it into a creation energy energy that they used to build. And that was the foundation idea for the Utopians, was that they would take in pain and output bricks, which in the end, hopefully some of that comes across and maybe it makes a little more sense now. But it was so conceptual at the time, and I had to hammer away at it to have it make sense. So the Chimera still exist, and they still take in the pain from outside, but it's far more concrete now. The Chimera are utilizing the nanite cloud that exists all across their world, and it feels like magic. It feels a little bit like philosophy magic, but the way it's been described is far more concrete now. It's actually the world in which they live having this technological explosion as a result of an actual explosion. The arc that brought them there, the disaster that broke that thing apart and scattered it across the planet. So here's something else, the White Bishops. The White Bishops look just incredible. This picture means so much to me because, I don't know, I love it. I didn't ask for any of these to be painted. I found these and asked the artists if we could license them because they meant so much to me that I felt that I could put them together and create a world out of them. I'd fill in the gaps later on with work that we would commission because all I wanted was for a game to look the way that Magic had looked when I was 8 years old, when it felt like I had actually found a spell book, because everything was drawn by a different person and every person had their own feeling of how that world was gonna look. Originally, there were 8 factions. So the Windwalkers have stayed the same. These have stayed the same since I was 15. Me and a friend just came up with this idea of these people who lived in a valley that was constantly hit by wind from only one side. So the people became like weird and leathery on only one side of their bodies, and they called themselves the Windwalkers. It was just supposed to be weird and funny and strange at the time. And the more I delved into that idea, the more I kept writing like weird stories about these people and trying to figure out like how their lives would actually work if they lived like that in this very windy, very one-directional area. The wind no longer has much to do with their civilization. You'll see it a couple of times inside of the deck, but most of this has to do with the Windwalkers being a representation of my feelings about like xenophobia. So, which is really weird for a game that these are so silly and strange. But the Windwalkers are the only people that have made friends with the native life. In fact, none of the other decks usually even talk about the native life we call the Lilin. They don't even say anything. They see them as animals to be exterminated, and the Windwalkers are talking to them, and the Lilin are talking back. And as a result, the Windwalkers are one of the most powerful factions in the game militarily because they've made friends. A lot of the other ones aren't interested in friends. They're not interested in diplomacy, especially with something that looks like a giant termite. They are afraid of them, and fear turns to hostility. And the Lilin are my imagination of these giant termites that operate very much like termites do in our real world. Termites are a eusocial species like human beings, and they have to live alongside ants, which are also a little bit like human beings, kind of a little bit more like human beings, because they're constantly raiding and killing the termites. That's the society in which they live. These massive termites, which build these big termite mounds that we call the wind cathedrals, are peaceful. The Lilin don't want to fight. Humans are constantly raiding them and fighting them, and the Lilin defend themselves, and the Windwalkers are the only ones who thought to trade, to give them things in return for what the Lilin have to offer, which is shelter and knowledge of how the planet actually works, and water, which the Lilin can stockpile, and other people don't have fresh water. That was my idea for the Windwalkers, and I hope that comes across in the deck, because it's really important to me that if people drill down enough into these decks, that they can see that the game isn't as grimdark as it appears at first, because it's not that kind of game. This isn't Warhammer. Like, this isn't endless, non-stop nightmare wars that can never end. This is, like, there's hope at the bottom of every deck, right? You have to go through all 30 cards, and you get to the end, and you're like, oh, actually, they have something there. Like, there's a reason that they're here. There's something they're here to tell us about like, the goodness of people, not the badness of people. Like, you're being offered bullets, melt them down, and make them into coins. That's what I'm asking you to do. And that's where the idea from the Coriolans came from. There was a line in, I can't remember what game it was. There's a game, there's a major game, a big game, a good game. You can tell me what it is in the comments. Where they said that they were melting down gold coins or gold bullion to make bullets. And that was how the Exiles, that was how I started off by building the Exiles, was by thinking about what would happen in a society that had become so decadent that they their combat became almost ritualistic, and people who were being oppressed by them decided to rise up and just destroy them, and their ruling class was essentially thrown back into the Stone Age, and now they have to start from scratch. The Coriolans are just trying to exist, and they're not leading you in any specific ideological direction. And out of that grew the hegemony. Hegemony. The hegemony. It's hegemony. The hegemony, like, this was the exact opposite idea. Instead of the Coriolans being more real people than I had designed before, the hegemony was like this archetype of they're just pirates. Like, that was just the idea. Like, what if they're just pirates? Like, what if it's just as many people as there are anywhere else, but these people are just, they're all awful? And I'd never really come up with that idea, because the whole point of every other civilization was that they're not all terrible. Like, they have bad qualities and they have good qualities, and they mix and match, and they're in war. But the hegemony is just bad all the way down, and that was like, because people always want something like that. Like, not everybody wants to be preached to, and there's so many preachy cards in here. And the hegemony is the only one that just never preaches to you. The church is special because of the name Wormwood. People always ask, like, why is it called that? It's this high sci-fi game, like, because every other sci-fi game is space word : religious word. And they don't know that Wormwood is the religious word, part of the space word. Wormwood is the asteroid that destroys the Earth in Revelations. And the church was the second faction I came up with, which was like, okay, the Windwalkers are the first. They're the ones that, like, I've been thinking about since I was a child. The church is the thing that represents, like, where this world actually is what is humanity becoming? Where are we headed? How are we changing? What are we retaining? The church is the thing that's lasted for 1,000 years. They're the thing that's been, like, taking stories and modifying them and manipulating them, and they're the ones who are trying to make sense of the world around them, but they don't have the necessary faculties to do so. So religion becomes the, like, lens by which they look through to understand why we're here. So many of the people on Absinthian, the planet that they're on in Wormwood, don't remember. Even when they came out of the Ark, they didn't remember who they were, where they were, why they're here, what happened to Earth. The church is the one that tries to make sense of that and tries to explain that story to you. And you'll see that on the cards, where they try and describe why people are here. Not just that people exist, but that there's a purpose to all of this, that there's a meaning to all of this. And they started off as by far the most militaristic faction. By far. Like, I was making a point. These were crusaders. They were out for blood all the time, and they were there to kill all the native life and subjugate the population. And over time, I sort of changed that, and now the deck only has half of that. And now there's like a mixture. There's more of a gray area where the church still has shock troops, but it also has hope in there, in the deck, somewhere. Find it. Look through the deck, find it, and make it happen. They can play peacefully now, and they couldn't always do that. These are things that they just couldn't do before, because I was looking at them as more of an archetype, and now these decks are more rounded, and now these civilizations are more rounded, and there's more going on behind the scenes as their themes become more crystallized. It makes the decks more interesting. That wouldn't be nearly as interesting if I had chosen those mechanics ahead of time and tried to create something that where the math made sense rather than where the people made sense. Because that's all I'm trying to do, is make a game where the people make sense and the math comes after. That's why the game took 10 years. That sentence is why the game took so long to make, because balancing the game was never the course of looking at an Excel sheet and saying, where do we fit the math in? If we have a mana curve, how do we fit into the middle of that curve to make it smooth? It was, how do I shuffle the cards in such a way that I can get you to feel something every time you draw? There's a reason that independent designers don't make games like this usually, or they make them as trading card games where they don't really have to be balanced by the designers. They're balanced by the players, right? Those are toolboxes, they're sandboxes that players create the balance. Players create the metagame, they balance against each other. And I didn't want it to be that way. I wanted you to be able to pull a game out from your shelf. You could have 3 friends who had never played a CCG in their life and say, I've got this amazing game. It's really complicated, but don't worry, you don't have to build a deck. You just have to hold a deck, take it out of the box, and play it. Where the barrier to entry is so much lower than it is for other games like this, because I love games like Netrunner or Magic or Vampire. It's not called Jihad anymore. Vampire Rivals is what it's called now. Battletech, the CCG, and other weird CCGs that popped up and died in the 90s. These were really interesting ideas that grew from like tabletop RPGs that became these tactical combat games that just had such a high barrier to entry that almost none of them survived. Because who would want to introduce your friends to something that has to be a lifestyle game or die, right? It's going to cost $1,000 and you have to spend all of your time, and even then you might lose, is a really hard ask for people you like. And this was meant to evoke the feeling that I had when I was really little and I didn't have any money. And the only way I got cards was by people handing me them. And I would get handed random magic cards. I didn't know how to play, but like the magic of feeling the cards was part of it. You look at the cards and you read the cards, and that's the first step. And then you start learning how the game is played, and that's the second. But the final step in all of those games was learning that you are terrible, and that without spending thousands of dollars, you are going to lose every single round because you've gotten just good enough to know how bad you are compared to the overarching structure of the actual game. The big picture, right, is always that you need to spend more. And that was something that I did not want to happen with this game. It's been a really long process. This is like 1% of how many different things have gone into this over time, and how many things have gone in, gone out, and how many ways the game has changed narratively and mechanically. This is like the tip of an iceberg. Hopefully, if you're either a designer or you're really into these kinds of games and you want to know more about how these decks are made or how these cards are made or like the process of constructing something like this from an independent perspective, it's a lot of work and it's a lot of fun, and it's worth it to create something that's really special that doesn't need a giant company behind it to drive it. More games need to be made that have like really dense emotional resonance and story, and like just a lot going on behind the scenes. And hopefully, like, this is one of many. We're just a small piece in this like weird board game revolution that's going on. There's room for all of these games. There's room for games that have this kind of depth in them. And there's a big space, I think, where people want games like this. I have no idea how we're going to edit this, because I just ranted for like, I don't even know how long about just like random Wormwood design ideas.
35 minutes.
That was okay. Well, we got to cut this down to like, we're going to cut this down to 10 minutes. If you like what you heard, or you like what you've seen, or you want more Wormwood, you can always check it out at fallofwormwood.com. You can get on our Discord, and there's lots of people who want to play the game online. For example, at our Tabletop Simulator module, where you can play for free online. You can print out a copy for free if you want. You can sign up for our mailing list, where you can find out where and how our Kickstarter is going to actually happen, and how you can get a copy for yourself on your table and play this game with your friends.